I need to tell you something that will change everything you thought you knew about me, I whispered into the recording device, my hands trembling as I sat alone in my prayer room at 3 a.m. The single candle I'd lit cast dancing shadows on the wall, but nothing could illuminate the darkness I was about to confess. You see me as the man who played Jesus, the actor who brought hope to millions, but what I'm about to reveal will shock you to your core. My final prayer wasn't a plea for success or fame or even salvation. It was something far more dangerous, something that could destroy everything I've built, but it was the only prayer that could save my soul. The recording device blinked red in the dim light, and I knew there was no turning back. For months, I've been carrying a secret that's been eating me alive from the inside. People think they know Jonathan Roumie, they think they understand my faith journey, but they have no idea what really happened during those dark months when I disappeared from the public eye. They don't know about the vision that changed everything, the encounter that left me questioning not just my career, but my very existence. I reached for the small, worn crucifix on my desk, the same one my grandmother had given me before she passed. She used to hold it during her evening prayers, whispering words in her native tongue that I never understood as a child. "Pray for courage," she would say, "because someday you'll need to choose between what the world wants from you and what God is calling you to do." I thought she was talking about being a good Catholic boy, going to Mass, saying my prayers. I had no idea she was preparing me for the most terrifying decision of my life. The silence in the room was deafening as I stared at the flickering flame, knowing that once I spoke these words, there would be no going back. My final prayer wasn't just shocking, it was revolutionary. It was the kind of prayer that could end careers, destroy reputations, and change the course of a life forever. But it was also the prayer that revealed the truth about what it really means to follow Jesus, not just play him on screen. And what I discovered in that moment of absolute surrender will leave you speechless, just like it left everyone who heard it that night. I wasn't the man of faith you thought I was, I continued, my voice cracking as the weight of my confession settled over me like a heavy blanket. The truth is, I'd been living a lie for years, standing in front of cameras preaching about love and sacrifice while my own heart was slowly turning to stone. I chose red carpets over prayer meetings. I chose magazine interviews over Bible study. I chose the applause of strangers over the quiet whisper of God's voice in my soul. And with each choice, I was building a house of cards that was about to come crashing down. The recording device captured every breath, every pause, every moment of raw honesty that I'd been too afraid to share with anyone. This wasn't the Jonathan Roumie the world knew. This was the real me, the one who prayed frantically in bathroom stalls between takes, begging God to help me become the man I was pretending to be on screen. I'd been playing Jesus for so long that I'd forgotten how to actually follow him. My grandmother used to light candles just like this one, kneeling by her bed every single night, praying for her grandson who she feared was losing his way. She'd whisper, "Lord, don't let the world steal his heart. Don't let fame become his God." I used to think she was being dramatic, overly religious, stuck in old traditions. But now I understand she was seeing something I was blind to. She was watching me slowly drift away from the very faith that had shaped my entire identity. If I hadn't made the choice I'm about to tell you about, if I hadn't prayed that shocking prayer that night, I would have become just another Hollywood actor who wore faith like a costume. My children would have grown up with a father who talked about God on interviews but never talked to God in private. My wife would have been married to a man who could quote scripture on command but couldn't find peace in his own soul. And millions of people who looked up to me would have been following a fraud, a man who was more concerned with his image than his integrity. The candle flame danced higher, casting longer shadows across the room, and I could almost hear my grandmother's voice warning me about the price of spiritual compromise. She knew that everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I'd become would crumble if I didn't find my way back to authentic faith. And she was right. The choice I was about to make would test everything I claimed to believe about God, about sacrifice, about what it really means to take up your cross and follow Jesus. I remember the exact moment I realized I'd lost myself. I said, standing up and walking to the window where moonlight filtered through the blinds like prison bars. It was during the filming of The Chosen's third season, and I was in the middle of delivering the Sermon on the Mount. Thousands of extras were watching, cameras were rolling, and I was speaking the words of Jesus with perfect pronunciation and emotional depth. But inside, I felt absolutely nothing. The words that should have set my soul on fire were just lines I'd memorized, and I was terrified that everyone could see right through me. After that scene wrapped, I locked myself in my trailer and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The beard, the long hair, the robes, everything looked exactly like Jesus, but my eyes were empty. I'd become so good at performing faith that I'd forgotten how to actually live it. That night, I called my spiritual director, Father Miguel, the priest who'd guided me through my conversion years earlier. "I feel like a fraud," I whispered into the phone, afraid that someone might overhear. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Jonathan, the devil's greatest victory isn't getting good people to do bad things. It's getting holy people to forget they need God." I walked back to my chair, picking up a small prayer book that had belonged to my grandmother. Its pages were worn thin from decades of use, filled with her handwritten prayers in the margins. I found the page where she'd written my name, surrounded by little crosses and hearts. Even before I became an actor, even before The Chosen existed, she was praying for my soul. She wrote, "Lord, protect Jonathan's heart. Don't let success steal his hunger for you." The discovery had shaken me to my core when I found it after she passed away. How had she known? How had she seen the spiritual battle that was coming for me? The recording device continued to blink, capturing every word as I shared the darkest period of my spiritual life. Between seasons 2 and 3 of The Chosen, I'd stopped praying altogether. Not because I was angry at God, but because I felt unworthy to approach Him. Here I was, playing Jesus in front of millions of people, inspiring them to follow Christ, while my own prayer life had withered away to nothing. I'd wake up in the morning and immediately check social media instead of opening my Bible. I'd fall asleep scrolling through emails instead of saying my evening prayers. I was living on spiritual fumes, and I was terrified that one day the tank would run completely empty. Father Miguel had warned me about this exact scenario years earlier when I first got the role. He said, "Playing Jesus is the most dangerous role an actor can take, not because of the pressure from the world, but because of the pressure from the enemy. Satan doesn't want you to succeed in this, and he'll use your own success against you." I'd laughed it off back then, thinking I was stronger than that, thinking my faith was unshakable. But pride goes before the fall, and I was about to learn that lesson in the most humbling way possible. The candle burned lower as I continued speaking, its light growing dimmer just like my spiritual flame had been during those dark months. I'd been so busy talking about Jesus that I'd stopped talking to Jesus, and the emptiness that created was slowly consuming me from the inside out. "There's something about midnight prayers that strip away all pretense," I said, returning to my chair and picking up my grandmother's rosary, its worn wooden beads smooth from decades of faithful fingers. She used to tell me that God speaks loudest in the silence, when the world is asleep and our souls have nowhere to hide. I'd found her prayer journal hidden in her bedroom after the funeral, filled with prophecies about my life that sent chills down my spine. On a page dated 10 years before The Chosen was even conceived, she wrote, "Lord, I see my grandson standing before multitudes, speaking your words, but I also see him standing at a crossroads. He will have to choose between being famous for you or faithful to you." The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow as I read them by candlelight in her empty house. How had she known? How had she seen the spiritual warfare that would surround this role, the temptation to use Jesus as a stepping stone to stardom rather than a pathway to sanctity? I found letter after letter, prayer after prayer, all focused on protecting my soul from the very thing that was now happening to me. She'd written, "The enemy will try to make him believe that playing Jesus is the same as following Jesus. Don't let him confuse performance with devotion." I opened her Bible carefully, its leather cover cracked with age and use, and found the passage she'd underlined in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven." In the margin, she'd written my name with a question mark, as if she was asking God to protect me from becoming the very person Jesus warned about. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally saying "Lord, Lord" on camera every day, bringing people to tears with my portrayal, while my own spiritual life was crumbling. The recording device seemed to glow brighter in the darkness as I shared this revelation, this moment when I realized that my grandmother had been interceding for my soul long before I even knew I needed intercession. She'd seen the trap that awaited me, the subtle pride that would creep in when people started calling me Jesus on the street, when they'd ask for my blessing instead of God's. She knew that the most dangerous thing that could happen to my faith wasn't persecution or rejection, but success without surrender. I think she knew that I would need these prayers someday. I continued, flipping through more pages filled with her careful handwriting. She knew that all my achievements would feel empty if I didn't have authentic relationship with Christ to anchor them. She knew that I would realize too late that the most important thing in life isn't being known for playing Jesus, but being known by Jesus himself. Her final entry, written just days before she passed, was a prayer that made my hands shake as I read it aloud. She prayed, "Lord, if my grandson ever loses his way, if fame ever becomes more important to him than faith, please do whatever it takes to bring him back to you. Break his heart if you have to. Humble his pride if you must. But don't let him reach the end of his life having missed the point of it all." The candle flickered as if responding to her words, and I wondered if this moment, this dark night of the soul, was the answer to her desperate prayer. Maybe everything that was about to happen had been orchestrated from heaven, a divine intervention disguised as a career crisis. The metaphor she'd used years earlier suddenly made perfect sense. She'd said, "You can't light others' candles with a flame that's already gone out." I'd been trying to inspire millions while my own spiritual fire was dying, and it was only a matter of time before everyone would notice that the light they were drawn to was just an illusion. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in my agent's office, surrounded by scripts and contracts that promised to make me the biggest faith-based actor in Hollywood. I said, my voice heavy with the memory of that pivotal moment. They wanted me to sign a multi-million-dollar deal for a franchise that would span decades, movies that would put me in the same category as the biggest action stars, but there was a catch. The script required me to compromise everything I claimed to believe about faith, about morality, about the very gospel I'd been proclaiming on screen. I walked to the bookshelf and pulled out the contract I'd never signed, its pages still crisp and unmarked. The executives had called it evolution, saying that audiences were ready for a more progressive Jesus, one who would appeal to modern sensibilities without all the restrictive elements of traditional Christianity. They wanted me to play a version of Christ that endorsed things the real Jesus never would have endorsed, to speak words that would make the gospel more palatable to a world that didn't want to hear about sin or sacrifice or surrender. My agent had looked at me with dollar signs in his eyes and said, "Jonathan, this is your ticket to the A-list. This is how you go from being known in Christian circles to being known worldwide." But as I stared at those pages, all I could hear was my grandmother's voice warning me about the price of compromise. She used to say, "The devil doesn't come to you wearing a red suit and carrying a pitchfork. He comes wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase full of everything you think you want." The pressure was immense, I continued, setting the contract down and returning to my chair. My management team, my publicist, even some of my closest friends were telling me I'd be crazy to turn down this opportunity. They said I could use the platform to reach more people, that I could be a light in the darkness of Hollywood. But what they couldn't understand was that you can't be a light for Jesus by dimming the truth about Jesus. You can't lead people to the real Christ by portraying a fake one. I remember the exact moment I realized I'd rather lose everything than compromise everything. It was during a meeting with the studio heads, powerful people who could make or break careers with a single phone call. They were explaining how they wanted to update Jesus for modern audiences, how they wanted to make him more inclusive, more accepting, more aligned with current cultural trends. As they spoke, I felt something dying inside me, not just my career prospects, but my very soul. That night, I drove to the same church where I'd filmed some of the most powerful scenes from The Chosen, but this time the cameras weren't rolling. I sat in the empty sanctuary, staring at the crucifix above the altar, and for the first time in months, I tried to pray. But the words wouldn't come. I'd been so busy performing faith that I'd forgotten how to practice it. I'd been so concerned with being believable as Jesus that I'd stopped believing in Jesus myself. The silence was deafening as I knelt there in the darkness, feeling the weight of every compromise I'd already made, every small step away from truth that had led me to this moment. My grandmother had been right to pray for my protection, because the enemy hadn't come at me with obvious temptation. He'd come with opportunity, with success, with the promise of reaching more people while slowly eroding the very message I was supposed to be sharing. I pulled out my phone and showed the recording device a photo I'd taken that night in the church. It was just me, alone in the pew, looking small and broken beneath the massive cross. But that brokenness was exactly where God wanted to meet me, exactly where He'd been waiting for me to stop performing and start surrendering. I started going to adoration again, not because I had to, but because I was desperate, I said, remembering those sacred midnight hours in a forgotten chapel where nobody knew my name. I'd slip in through the side door when the world was asleep and the blessed sacrament sat exposed on the altar, waiting for anyone brave enough to sit in the presence of true divinity. The first night, I couldn't even look at the monstrance. I sat in the back pew with my head in my hands, feeling like the biggest fraud who'd ever walked into a church. Here I was, the man who'd portrayed Jesus on screen, and I couldn't even make eye contact with Him in the Eucharist. But something happened in that silence, something I'd forgotten was possible when you stop talking and start listening. Father Miguel found me there one night, tears streaming down my face as I knelt before the altar. He didn't say anything at first, just knelt beside me in the darkness. Finally, he whispered, "You know what the difference is between Judas and Peter? They both betrayed Jesus, but only one came back." Those words shattered something inside me that had been holding back a flood of grief and desperate hope. I returned every night for 3 weeks. I continued, picking up the small notebook where I'd written my thoughts during those holy hours. The entries were raw, unfiltered, sometimes just single words like mercy or help. One night I wrote, "Lord, I'm tired of pretending to know you when I barely remember what it feels like to love you." Another night, simply, "Make me real." It was during the 4th week that everything changed. An elderly woman, probably in her 80s, knelt near the altar and began to pray with her whole being. Her face was radiant, completely absorbed in conversation with Jesus. When she stood to leave, she noticed me and smiled. "He's been waiting for you," she said, nodding toward the altar. "Not the version of Him you've been playing, but the real Him. He's been waiting for you to stop acting and start adoring." That night, I finally approached the altar and knelt directly in front of the monstrance. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about cameras or audiences. I was just a man in desperate need of his Savior, and in that moment of absolute vulnerability, I encountered the Jesus I'd been portraying but never truly knowing. Jesus had been waiting, not for Jonathan Roumie the actor, but for Jonathan the sinner, Jonathan the doubter, Jonathan the man who'd lost his way and finally found the courage to come home. My grandmother's prayers hadn't been wasted. Every rosary, every candle, every tear had been building to this moment of authentic faith that would change everything. The call came at 6 in the morning on a Sunday. Just as I was preparing for Mass, I said, staring at my phone like it contained a weapon aimed at my soul. It was my agent, screaming with excitement about Netflix offering me the biggest faith-based contract in Hollywood history. 10 seasons, billions of viewers worldwide, more money than I'd ever dreamed of. But there was a catch that made my blood freeze. They wanted me to sign an exclusivity deal that would ban me from ever playing Jesus again, anywhere, for anyone else. They called the chosen small time and said I was limiting my potential. They wanted to own my faith-based career completely, to control how I portrayed biblical characters, to ensure my Christianity aligned with their global vision that welcomed all beliefs without claiming any absolute truth. I set the phone down and walked to my prayer room, the same room where I'm recording this now. On one side was financial security for generations, worldwide fame, the chance to reach billions. On the other side was integrity, authenticity, and loyalty to the project that had changed my life. For 3 days, I didn't sleep, I continued. Everyone was calling, begging me to take the deal. My financial advisor said I'd be crazy to refuse. My publicist said it would make me legendary. Even family members were asking why I was hesitating when the answer seemed so obvious. But every time I tried to pray about it, I heard my grandmother's voice. Just because a door opens doesn't mean God is opening it. Sometimes the devil opens doors too, and they always lead to beautiful prisons. The Netflix offer felt like the most beautiful prison I'd ever seen. On the third night, I was back in that little chapel when the elderly woman appeared again. She whispered, "When they offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, what did he say?" Her question pierced my heart. I knew the answer. Jesus had said, "Away from me, Satan. Worship the Lord your God, and serve him only." The parallels were impossible to ignore. Here I was, being offered kingdoms, fame, wealth, global influence. All I had to do was compromise just a little bit, just enough to make my faith palatable to a world that didn't want to hear about the exclusive claims of Christ. The choice wasn't about money or career. It was about worship. Who was I going to serve? I left the chapel knowing what I had to do, but terrified to do it. The next morning, I would turn down the biggest opportunity of my career. I would disappoint everyone counting on me to take the safe, smart choice. But first, I had to pray one final prayer, the prayer that would shock everyone who heard it, the prayer that would define not just my career but my eternal destiny. "I'm going to tell you my final prayer now," I said, holding the recording device close to my face, my hands steady for the first time all night. "This is the prayer that cost me everything the world values and gave me everything that actually matters. This is the prayer that shocked everyone who heard it." I knelt down right here, in this same spot, I continued. The candle had burned down to almost nothing, and in that flickering light, I felt God's presence stronger than ever. This wasn't performance. This wasn't acting. This was the most real moment of my entire life. "My final prayer was this," I said, pausing to make sure every word was clear. "Lord Jesus, I don't want anything that you don't want for me. Take away my career if it's stealing my soul. Take away my fame if it's becoming my God. I'd rather be unknown and loved by you than famous and forgotten by you." But the shocking part came next. I prayed, "God, I'm giving you permission to destroy everything I've built if that's what it takes to rebuild me. I choose you over Netflix. I choose you over millions of dollars. I choose you over everything, even if it means I never work again." People called me crazy when I turned down that deal. They said I was throwing away my career for nothing. But what they couldn't understand was that I wasn't throwing anything away. I was finally picking up what I'd been dropping for years. In the distance, church bells began to chime, marking a new day. My grandmother's prayers had finally been answered. She'd prayed for a grandson who would choose faithfulness over fame, and that night, her intercession gave me the courage to do exactly that. "This is my final prayer," I whispered. "Not that you'll be successful or famous, but that you'll have the courage to pray what I prayed that night. God, I want you more than anything else, even if having you means losing everything else." The candle died, but the darkness felt like dawn. My grandmother's final wish had been granted. Her grandson had learned that the most powerful prayer isn't asking God for what we want, but offering him everything we are. And that shocking prayer is still being answered every single day.